Today we'll take a look at even more amazing builds you can create in Shadow of the Erdtree. We're going to exclusively focus on PvE, but also go over some of the more overlooked mechanics that I really liked but didn't see many people building around them. The first one is actually one of my new favorites. It's called the Divine Beast Stormcaller build and basically makes use of storm abilities and boosts the damage on those with some of the new items added in the DLC. Specifically with the Storm Blade, which was already amazing in the base game. It's actually even better in the DLC because of all the extra damage you get from the Tree upgrades. I put this on a Keen Great Katana. This is going to be a predominantly dexterity build, so it absolutely shreds enemies from afar. It doesn't really cost any FP, and we're going to get a ton of regen for FP to basically cast this infinitely. So here's the setup. I'm using a Great Katana with a Keen Affinity. Like I said, this is a dexterity build and I also slapped that Storm Blade on it. On top of this, it's going to deal some really crazy damage if you also go in melee range. Not only do you hit enemies with the Ash of War, but also with the physical component of the Great Katana, which has an excellent reach because, I mean, Great Katanas are really big. Besides this, we also use that Divine Beast Helm, which provides an extra 4% to storm damage, plus 4 into dex and strength. You can also use, of course, that Divine Beast Head from earlier in the game for some better stats, but it's going to be much bigger. And we also couple this with the Enraged Divine Beast Talisman, which provides another 10% on top for storm damage, and then we can add the Shard of Alexander for another 15. So that's a really nice extra 30% damage, give or take. We also use the Blue Dew Talisman, the new one added in the DLC. This adds 1 extra FP every 2 seconds, which is going to couple really well with the Storm Blade. That one has a very low FP cost as it is, so we can basically spam our Ash of War almost infinitely. The Two-Handed Sword Talisman also fits this build really well, but it's only going to affect the physical damage of the Great Katana, not the Ash of War. But it is going to give you another 15% damage increase to that, so it can be quite useful. Besides this, our stats look like this. We have 60 Vigor, 18 into Mind, which is more than enough, 27 to 28 in Endurance, 19 Strength, and then finally 70 into Dexterity. You can also put some 25 points into Faith or more if you want to cast some additional incantations, or even more so use the Golden Vow and get some extra AR. Now this build can also make use of the Horned Warrior Greatsword. This comes with the Horn Calling Storm, which is another storm ability that does get buffed by the 2 items. So it can actually work really great. It's not the best in the game, but it is pretty decent at corner hitting enemies. It can actually pass through walls. It's also amazing as an AoE damage dealer, and you can definitely use it when you tend to get surrounded by enemies. I actually used it quite often, but it is something that you only get like super late unless you farm some of the early horned enemies. Now the second is going to be Bayle's Dragon Communion build. I really wanted to create a build around his incantations because I just found the whole boss encounter and the abilities you unlock so freaking cool. Now there are some drawbacks to it, but you can still reach some amazing damage potential, stagger as well. Plus it comes with some unique mechanics, and specifically we're going to use Bayle's Flame Lightning as well as Bayle's Tyranny, both really awesome, with the first one pulling slightly ahead in terms of usefulness and damage. You can actually chain cast this and completely overwhelm targets, and also eventually stagger them because the stance damage is not too shabby. So in this case, we're kind of making use of a few things. One of them is going to be the new Rock Heart. This is going to be our armor set basically, because we can use this to boost all Dragon Communion incantations, which, yeah, Bayle's incantations are also part of. And on top of that, we also use a double Dragon Communion seal with a high arcane build, in this case about 70, as we further want to double boost Dragon Communion incantation damage. And since we are constantly in that dragon form, we don't get to equip any armors, so our equip load is actually really low, which means we can take full advantage of the Blue Dancer charm. Now this only boosts physical damage, but guess what? Our Bayle's Lightning attack actually has a lot of its damage tied to physical. So yeah, it's still going to greatly benefit from having this charm equipped. And besides this, I also went with a Lightning Scorpion charm, since our second source of damage is going to be lightning, plus a couple of those Canvas Talismans. Now, I prefer 2 Canvas Talismans because it's a much better option than sacrificing one of them for a Fire Scorpion charm or even a Talisman of the Dread, since fire barely is even a component of your lightning Bayle attack. That's because only the final lingering pool of lava deals any fire damage, and even that is negligible at best. That is why, in my opinion, 2 canvas talismans are the better options. But you can sacrifice any of these and go for a dragon crest shield, for example, or anything to increase maybe your defenses, your poise, so that you don't easily get interrupted during the animation. Here are the stats, by the way. Again, 60 vigor, 30 points into mind, but maybe go for a bit more, 24 into endurance, and basically we dump everything else into arcane, but also keeping like faith to 25, since we do need that golden vow. Do it like this and you're going to be golden. Now for the third build, I really wanted something that uses ranged weapons, and specifically longbows. I wanted to create a build like this in Elden Ring since day one. Well, it's kind of finally possible with not that many drawbacks. That's going to be the Ansbach Longbow build, which basically makes use of the new DLC Longbow. This is probably the strongest option in the game, and specifically because of the fan shot special ability on it. This one is so strong that you don't even have to hit enemies with all the arrows that it shoots at the same time, which is like about 5 or 6. One is more than enough to deal the full damage, and from my testing, also the full build up. On top of the fact that we can also use some of the new arrow sting talisman to basically get an 18% extra damage to our arrows, plus a 50% to range. We can just snipe enemies from so far away. So stacking build up on enemies is very awesome. Most of the large hitbox enemies can easily be dealt with way before they even reach you, making this a very good build even in the DLC. The downside, of course, is the fact that you need tons of arrows. You'll be consuming these like crazy, but luckily you can buy a lot of them from just the Twin Maiden Husk, assuming that you unlock them over there. That being said, here are the items that make this build work. Specifically, these 2 talismans right here are the most important, including the Arrow Soaring Sting Talisman and the regular Arrow Sting Talisman from the base game. They do stack together, so in total they will provide 18% extra damage to arrow damage, plus a 50% to range. So this means you can snipe enemies from far away and have minimal to no fall off in your damage. Besides this, I'm also using that 2-headed turtle talisman from the new DLC. We do consume stamina quite a lot, and we do need to regen it really quickly for the next batch of attacks. So that's why I'm adding this. Plus, of course, that Shard of Alexander for another 15% damage on top. For the armor set, it doesn't really matter. Go with the Cursed Blade Mask and Rakshasa set and you should be golden. That's going to provide you some extra dexterity and also the extra damage that you need at the cost of reducing some of your defenses. But like we talked before, it's not as big if you have enough Scatter Tree upgrades. At number 4, we haven't talked about a full-on hand-to-hand combat build. Well, here is one. I think, in my opinion, that the Bleed one is the most optimal option, just because you don't have to also sacrifice points into intelligence. You just go strength and dexterity predominantly, and you can also add some extra arcane in there to increase that bloodlust build up. But this is going to work with the Dry Leaf Whirlwind, and we're going to use the Dane Footwork. This is the much better option since your kick attacks have a much better reach than the palm attacks. You can of course keep the other one for the palm blast, which is still going to have the same range. But I love this one with the hand-to-hand and the Dry Leaf Whirlwind because it stacks that bloodlust build up so easily, and there are so many items in the game that further boost either your hand-to-hand combat, your kicks, or your jumps, or even in this case, the jump attacks. So here are the items that we're going to be using, boosting our kicking, stomping, and even jumping attacks by anywhere between 40 to 45%. So we can use the Black Feather, Raptor Black Feather, or the Gravebird Blackquill Armor, which is going to boost our jump attacks. We can couple these, of course, with the Claw Talisman, further boost that. But we also have the Divine Bird Warrior Greaves, which provides another 5% damage to our kicks and stomps. And of course, we also have that Shattered Stone Talisman, which provides another 10% damage to precisely what we need. But there are plenty other talismans that can work really well with this build. Like, for example, you can totally use a Shard of Alexander. You can also use a Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, since your Whirlwind is going to quickly hit targets. You can also go with the Godskin Swaddling Cloth. I actually went with a defense variant of this so that I could restore my HP on every Dry Leaf Whirlwind kick, and it actually made my survivability so much better. The only thing I had to worry about was defenses, damage negation basically, and poise, and I could just face tank even Mesmer with this build. You can even add a Lords of Blood Exaltation, and we are already using that white mask to further boost damage when there is bleed in our vicinity. But besides that, in terms of stats, we use 60 Vigor, about 20 into Mind, but I believe we had 16 actually over here, about 28 in Endurance, and then 55 and then 45 in Dexterity is what I had here, but I was boosting this with, yeah, some of the Golden Arcs, and you can dump the remaining points into Arcane, as that's going to help you a bit more with the build up. Now, before we go over the final build and possibly the strongest currently in the game, we do have another option. I really wanted to play with a Madness build, and luckily there are some items in the new DLC that further help with that. Stuff like the Madding Hand, and also of course one of the new charms in the game that further helps provide extra attack when we have Madness in our vicinity. So it can provide anywhere between 20 to 27% extra damage with these two items, making some of the abilities that were already strong, like for example the Frenzied Burst or even the Unending Frenzied, even stronger than they were before. So the items we're using here are going to be Double Seal, going with the Erdtree Seal in the left hand and the Frenzied Flame in the right hand, specifically because we're going to use that Erdtree Seal to have the highest incantation scaling damage. So that's going to be the one we use for casting, but we use the Frenzied Flame Seal in the other hand so that we can further gain that 20% damage to Frenzy Flame incantations. Besides this, we're also going to be using the Aged One Exaltation, which provides another 20% boost to our damage. Also that Black Dumpling for another 10% all damage, and we can even implement a Howl of Shabriri for another 20% on top. So this is on top of everything else. I mean, you can even add a Madding Hand in one of your hands and have another 7% when there's madness in your vicinity. It can totally work. Plus, of course, the Rakshasa set. Overall, it's going to be absolutely crazy. Other talismans I'm using are the Flux Canvas, and you can also go with some protection like Dragon Crest, since you're going to be casting some long wind-up animations. For the stats, we're going with 60 Vigor, 34 Minds, 24 Endurance, and then we're dumping everything into Faith, going like 70 points into that at the least, but also pushing a bit of Intelligence and Arcane, since some of these incantations do require a few points into those. And finally, this brings us to the last but definitely not the least build, which is also the strongest, and that is the Bloodfiend Double Fork Bleed build. Yes, it's another one of those, and yes, we're yet again using a Bloodfiend weapon, but that's because they are so damn strong. We talked about the fork before, except this time around we are making use of it with a double seppuku setup. Because these are spears, and because they have such a good range, you can easily reach enemies from far away. Both your jumping, your running, as well as your dodging attack are all going to provide this really nice poke that easily stacks Bloodlust build-up. And because they don't really lose any Bloodlust build-up, even when you change them to that Occult Affinity, you're going to have a ton of that happening every single, well, not really every single hit, but it doesn't take more than a couple of hits to actually proc another bleed build-up on the target. As far as the items go, here they are. We have the two forks, which you're going to have to farm for. We also need the white mask plus the Lords of Blood Exaltation, which is going to buff our damage a lot. You can also use Thiolier's armor, which is going to provide you some extra boost into Arcane, and the remaining pieces are two of the Rakshasa items. Besides this, I'm going with, of course, a Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, the two-headed Turtle Talisman. Since we do consume a lot of stamina with our attacks, we want to regen that super fast. This helps a ton. And the final one is just a Dragon Crest Shield. Helps a ton with damage mitigation, since we're going to be, quite up there in the enemy's face. And with this, you're going to deal so much damage and destroy enemies so fast, it's going to be even better than the previous Bloodfiend arm, since obviously that's been nerfed. The only problem with this build is that it doesn't really have any stance damage, but you don't really need it. Basically, it's going to cause all enemies to die way before you even have to worry about it. And that is pretty much it with the top builds right now in the game. Let me know down below if there's any other options you know of. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.